Josie. We've got a few upcoming things. We've got ladies' class tomorrow, fellowship meal next week. It's been a little bit since we've had one, so try to keep that in mind. Saying that for my own benefit. See a few new prayer requests in there in the bulletin. Sullivan's niece Caitlin in the hospital, and Lori's sister Tanya passed away. Is there anything else we should make folks aware of?
I have an update.
Okay.
Last night, he said she had more eye movement, better response. This time she was responding to the stimuli with all four extremities. But this morning, he said there was a decline in eye movement on the neuro test, and they're waiting on the doctors to see what that means. So, it's still a very serious situation.
Okay. Thanks.
She's a student at Winsburg.
Wow. Anything else we should make known before we start this morning? Okay. Well, we will jump into the lesson then. Last week we started our lesson on church leadership. We primarily spent almost all of our time last week looking at Old Testament references to elders and the roles that they played. So just to start off this week to get a little discussion rolling, does anyone remember anything that we talked about last week, any lessons learned, or any of the roles that the elders played for God's people in the Old Testament?
Earlier than we all thought.
Yes. One thing that stood out to me, it was much earlier references than I had realized. What else?
I guess I was references to elders back then, specifically referencing old guys.
Right.
It seemed they had a specific function, and that was due to.
Yeah, and I was kind of in the same boat on that as well, because we talked a little bit about the fact that the term elder could mean just simply someone who is older, literally translated bearded ones, and certainly lots of instances where the same root word is used to just mean someone who's older or an older son. But there did seem to also be kind of a distinct role, like an office of sort, and they had specific tasks and duties that they were supposed to fulfill. And we'll see kind of some spillover of that idea, kind of the multiple uses of the same word in the New Testament. Anything else? Anything else that people remember or thought was interesting from last week? All right. To continue on from that idea, the position that elders had in the Old Testament before Christ, we see a little bit of spillover in that during the life of Christ, where this role, this group of people, the elders, were still around, still doing some functions, and we'll take a look at kind of their role during Christ's life quickly here to kind of wrap up that discussion of elders before Christ. So we've got 3 verses here. We'll do these in a little bit more like rapid fire. So if I could get volunteers for each, and then we'll just kind of read one right after another. Could I get a volunteer for Matthew 15, verse 2? Lisa? Thanks. Matthew 16:21. Someone willing to read that? They are on your sheets if that.
At that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised to life.
Thanks. And Matthew 26:47.
And while yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and sabers from the chief priests and elders of the
Thank you. So, what are a few things that we see the elders during the life of Christ doing? This would have been the elders of Israel. First one is a little different than the second two.
First was they establish and keep tradition.
Right. Yeah, so this would have been the kind of the stuff that was not necessarily in the law, but was in addition to the law that the Jesus' followers kind of ran afoul with a few times. So they were kind of responsible for, I assume, writing down, but kind of making and preserving this tradition. Good. And then in these last two, what do we see the elders doing in those verses?
The instigators and trying to get Jesus.
Yeah, and that was another thing that kind of surprised me. I kind of always thought about the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees. So it's interesting to look at examples of that term elder being used kind of with those groups that were coming to get Jesus. So we see in the Old Testament example of elders being a position that God ordained that had these specific tasks. And here in Jesus' time, we see them kind of not really truly following God's precepts and really causing trouble. So all that to say, to me, it was an interesting point to realize that this idea of elders as leaders was not at all going to be a new idea during when the apostles are setting up elders for the church after Jesus has left. Again, just something I thought was interesting, and I think points to the value of having those more mature people that we can look to for leadership as an idea that has been around for a long time.
It's almost funny to me that they wouldn't come up with a new term when they had kind of abused that office of elders back then, and even the New Testament, and all the Sanhedrin, Pharisees, essentially, all those were ones that they kind of created. So it's almost surprising that they weren't a bad taste in the mouth of those Jewish Christians, and that they wouldn't come up with a new term.
I kind of feel the same way, that it would have been a little bit tainted. It would have, I think, hard to kind of get away from that. Yeah, I don't know. That's what we have, so.
They also so ingrained in their culture.
Mm. Yeah,
They serve the purpose they knew already,
right,
what that kind of entailed, and
yeah,
so maybe it was kind of,
the context,
yeah.
yeah, and it's just a good, like, descriptive term, so, yeah, good points. Any other thoughts or discussion from elders in the Old Testament? Okay, we're going to start now getting into not only elders, but kind of a discussion of general terms that are used for leaders in the New Testament. So, first question is, what are some examples that anyone can think of leaders in the New Testament? This could be roles or even, specific people that you think of as leaders. What are some examples?
Before or after, right?
Um,
Church leadership?
yeah, we'll go Christian leaders after Christ.
Peter, for sure.
Yeah, Peter. Yeah, we've been talking about the apostles on our Wednesday class, and Peter was certainly one of the early leaders of the church, the rock. Good. What else? Who else?
Just reading Galatians this morning, all references Peter, and James, brother of Christ, and John as being early pillars. I think the word referenced them, so they were
Yeah.
certainly the leaders of the early church.
Good. Who else? Or kind of thinking in terms of titles or roles that would have been held.
Preachers and teachers we hear about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and depending on what what version you have, ministers, teachers, but yeah, certainly terms.
Elders and deacons.
Yep. Well, today we'll be spending most of our time on those two. Another one that, we've mentioned a few of them by name, but the apostles certainly would have been kind of, I feel like, the initial primary leaders of the church, of God's people. The 12, and then we don't know very much about him, but Matthias is then chosen after Jesus has left.
That include Paul in this early.
Yeah. Yep. Good. Anything else? Any other roles or titles, or certainly there's lengthy list of people we could add in there.
There's a group of men established to make sure the needs of the older Christians were being met, and I don't remember now their references deacons on that.
Yeah.
Scripture, but
Yeah.
a group that was established to give some kind of leadership.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, in Acts 2. I don't know if we'll discuss that group today, but certainly at some point in the next week or so, we'll probably look at that group in a little bit more detail. Good. Anything else? Next question is, who did God set up as the primary leader of his people since the New Testament? Yes, very good, very good. I was trick question, maybe not very nice of me, but yeah, very good. Jesus. We had a similar question last week of who is the should have been the primary leader of God's people in the Old Testament. So let's look at a couple examples of this, because I think in this discussion of church leadership and church structure, this should be the foundation of all of our discussions, of all of our planning, thinking, everything, is that we should hold Christ as the leader, the head of the church. Let's look at a couple of verses. Can I get a volunteer to read Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20? I'll just put an excerpt of this on the sheet, so if someone doesn't mind turning there to read that whole section.
He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by him, in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself, by making peace through the blood of his cross, whether things on earth or things in heaven.
Thanks. So in the teens class, we just were reading this, I guess it's been a few weeks now, but if one of the teens, could you kind of like summarize what that section is? Like, what's the main theme of that section? God, I'm sleeping. So on your sheet, we have that he being Christ is the head of the body, the beginning from the firstborn of everything. So this section is really talking about Christ being preeminent over everything. He is there from creation. He is preeminent over all. And certainly that includes his bride, the church, us today. So he is the head. He is really our ultimate leader, our everything that we should look to. 1 Peter 2:25. Someone be willing to read that one.
You were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your soul.
Thanks. So this is one, this is a little bit of foreshadowing, but who is this verse talking about the people returning to? Who is the shepherd, the bishop of their souls? Jesus, good. So we'll see these terms, shepherd and bishop, used in a very different role, but here we see them applied to Christ. And so again, as we think about church leaders, who they are, we see even these terms that will be used for other roles ultimately applied to Christ. And so we, again, should try to keep that at the forefront. The thing that underpins all of this discussion is Christ as the head of the body. Now we'll get into looking into a few of the terms for the roles that we talked about a question or two ago. This certainly is not an exhaustive list. I'm hoping we'll kind of get through. I'm struggling to come up with a good word for, because Scripture doesn't really use very consistently like the word title or role or office. We see, I think it's in 1 Timothy, we see the term, depending on the description, those that desire to be overseers desire a good role or task or office, depending on the translation. So we're going to be looking at some of these offices or roles or tasks. And three I'm hoping we're going to get through today are the role of the apostles, of elders, and the various terms that are used for them, and the third one is servants or deacons. So let's start with the role of the apostles. I guess before we read the verses, I'm curious if someone could just, in your own words, if you were trying to explain who the apostles were, how would you explain that to someone who has no context of what or who the apostles were? Teachers, yeah. But we certainly see examples of other teachers that were not apostles. So yes, they certainly were teachers, but what are some of the things that kind of set them apart or make their role different than others that would teach?
I would include the miraculous gifts.
Yeah, they had sort of I never know how to say these kinds of things, but they had an extra measure. They had the ability to do healings. Christ sent them out and they drove out demons, and but yeah, certainly miraculous abilities. What else? Anything else?
My interpretation of apostles, they were chosen by Christ too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And that's kind of one of the things that I think differentiates them from kind of the larger following of disciples that would have been traveling around listening to Christ teach, from kind of this inner 12 and later 13. They were the ones that were kind of called by Jesus and would have been with him throughout the core of his ministry.
I would also include the carried authority among the churches, even over elders. Paul would go teach elders, appoint elders, and so there was an authority that they were given that exceeded.
Yeah. Throughout a handful of different letters, we see Paul kind of defending his apostleship, and probably part of that is because that role, that task, carried some extra weight. It allowed them to kind of be direct mouthpieces for God in a lot of instances and do some of the direct teaching that would have been necessary before churches had scripture that was complete. So these men would have been really bringing the word directly from God to the early churches. Good. Anything else?
I don't know how important it is to establish it seems that these guys all, they were chosen by Christ, they were directly chosen by him. Some kind of, there's not apostles today.
Right.
Because there would not be that direct association, contact, however you might word it.
Yeah.
With Christ himself.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Good. All right, I think we've kind of covered most of the points that I was wanting to pull out through these scriptures. So let's go ahead and read them. Can volunteer for Acts 1:21 through 26.
Therefore, have carried with us all the time the Lord Jesus women, and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John to the day that he receiveth up from us. Of these must one become a witness with us of his resurrection. And they put forward two Joseph, called Barnabas, and whose surname Judas, and Matthew. And he prayed and said, Thou, Lord, who knowest the hearts of all men, show these to one whom thou hast chosen, and to take the place of the ministry and apostleship from Judas fall away, or fell away, that might go to his own place, and that they gave lots for them, and lots fell upon them, Matthias, and his number led the apostles.
Thank you. So we just kind of jumped into this passage. So can anyone describe what event is happening here in what we just read? Yes, very good. Yeah, so this is the time where they are choosing someone to fill that 12th slot after Judas kills himself. So there's verse 21 and 22, there's a few of the things that we learn were kind of, I guess, requirements for the men to become one of the apostles. What are some of these requirements that we read here?
Either baptism or resurrection.
Right. Yeah, so again, they had to be like physically with them. They had to be with Jesus during his ministry. And I guess, yeah, go ahead.
There were women here in this gathering, but
Right.
specifically calling out men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. What about verse 26? This one's maybe a little bit less direct, but what do you make of verse 26? Them casting lots to decide who would be the replacement.
That's an easy way to say that Jesus chose him as well.
Yeah, that's...
If you want to say Jesus had to choose him.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly, I believe that's what we see going on there. We see throughout Scripture times where casting lots was not just a game of chance rolling the dice, it was a medium by which God would speak to people to make decisions such as this. And so I agree that I think here they're casting lots, and it falling to Matthias is part of this direct calling that the apostles would have had to have. This wasn't just a personal calling that someone felt. It wasn't something that someone just decided to be an apostle, but there was this divine election being chosen by Christ himself. 2 Corinthians 12:12. Thanks. So this is one that we talked about already, but yeah, the apostles were doing these signs and wonders kind of beyond just physical healings that could be explained. So they had this ability to do these miracles. This could probably be this question I'm going to ask could probably be a study in and of itself. But what would the function have been for the elder or for the apostles to do these miraculous signs?
I think it's the same reason Jesus did it, to verify the message.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And again, this would have been a time before they had this book and could study it and verify it for themselves. This is time when the church is just starting and they are needing instruction, direct revelation from God. And how would early churches be able to really know the difference between someone that is speaking directly on God's behalf and just someone that is making stuff up? There's really no way to get in and study and verify for themselves. And so these signs and wonders would have been used to mark that what the apostles was saying was truth, was directly from God, and something that the early churches should be heeding, listening to.
I think it's very obvious to me that there must have been those that were falsely doing what you mentioned, just making up whatever, claiming apostleship. I've heard here said that true apostles, indicating maybe there are people that weren't. Paul had to constantly defend his apostleship because people were doubting. So apparently there were people, it seems, that were claiming apostleship or speaking as apostles when maybe they weren't.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Well, there were also people that the magicians and things that would do things and then they can have proof that yes, this is something.
Right. Yeah, true. Do 1 Corinthians 15, 3-9.
For I passed on to you as most important, that I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to over 500 brothers at one time, most of them still alive, but some fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as the one abnormally born, he also appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God.
Thanks. So it's again, this is one that's a little bit less cut and dry, but seems to be another one of the requirements for apostleship was to have seen the resurrected Christ. There's so Paul here is talking about a number of people that saw Christ after he was raised. But we see again here Paul kind of discussing his apostleship. So Paul would not have been around Jesus during his life, during his ministry, but he was called after Jesus died, after he raised, and was called to turn away from a life of doing the opposite of being an apostle. He was persecuting the church. So I guess to kind of try to wrap up a little bit this section of the apostles, and I think a lot of the points have already been made, but this was a very distinct group of men that had a very significant role in the New Testament. But they were a very select group. It was 13 of them. They had sort of these extra expectations that are unique to them, that we don't see expected of other types of leaders in the New Testament. And it's just interesting because I think there are examples of people today claiming to be apostles or having sort of these extra measures, but at least from my understanding and from what I see from Scripture, I think that the requirements for being an apostle could have really only been met by the people that lived during the time of Christ and fulfilled these requirements and these roles that we just studied. Any other thoughts, questions, comments on apostles? Okay. Got 5 minutes left, so we'll at least try to make it through one of these terms. We're going to start looking at the role of elders. There's a number of different terms that can be used for elders. They're used kind of somewhat interchangeably, but some of them have different connotations, different definitions. But there's kind of three main Greek words that are used for this role. So the words are written in bold on your sheet, and there's a few verses under each one. So we're going to read the verses and then try to, from the context of those verses, figure out what the Greek word would be translated to in our Bible. So the first word is episkopos, or however you say that. So if someone could read Acts 20 and 28.
Yeah, go ahead, Clark.
Keep watch over yourselves and all the flock, which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, be shepherds of the church of God, which he brought with his own blood. Bought with his own blood.
Thanks. Titus 1:7.
For the bishop must be blameless as God's steward, not self-willing
And then Philippians 1:1.
All Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, all the saints in Christ Jesus, the will of God, together with the overseers and deacons.
Thanks. So, hopefully I explained what we're doing well enough here. Did anyone from those verses think that they can pick out what word would have been translated episkopos? Bishops?
On that overseer.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so those are the two kind of options that this word is, at least in most common translations, translated to. So episkopos typically is either bishop or overseer. That's good. There's a couple in there that was a little bit, tricky, because we see a couple of terms being used in the same verse. Go down to the next term, presbyteros, Acts 14:23.
When they appointed elders in every church and prayed fasting, they did them into the Lord, in whom they had believed.
Thanks. 1 Timothy 5, verses 1 and verse 17.
Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and with all propriety, younger women as sisters. Verse 17. The elders who are good leaders should be considered worthy of an ample honorarium, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching.
Thanks. Titus 1:5.
For this reason I left you to Crete, that you might set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I direct you.
And then 1 Peter 5:1.
To the elders among you, I feel as fellow elder in the business of Christ's sufferings, who also share in the glory to be revealed.
Good. So did anyone pick up on the term? There's kind of two here.
Elder for sure.
Elder for sure. Yep.
Guessing presbyters.
Yes. Yeah. So the other one is presbyter, which is not commonly used. I think in the King James it's used at least once, but it's not even used from what I saw very frequently. We saw kind of another example too in 1 Timothy where the NIV and some other translations translate verse 1 as "do not rebuke an older man." So this word presbyteros, this is another word that we see used kind of multiple ways throughout Scripture. This would have been the same word for the elders that we talked about during Jesus' life that were trying to imprison him and cause him trouble. So this is a word that, depending on how it's translated, it could simply mean an older man, kind of the... I am not at all a Greek scholar, but there's a bunch of different uses for this. There's kind of a verb form as well. But so in addition to that kind of general use of older man, someone or something that's older, we certainly see this as being a specific role or task that is called out in the New Testament. We're a couple minutes over. Let's try to get this last one real quick so that we can kind of wrap up these terms. Acts 20:28.
You watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, shepherds of the church of God, which you bought with his own blood.
Thank you. And then 1 Peter 2:25.
You are continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd.
Good. Anyone pick up the common denominator? Right. Shepherd. This is another one that is often either translated as pastor or shepherd. So we see episkopos being bishop/overseer, the presbyteros being elder or presbyter, and this poimen often being translated as shepherd or pastor. So thanks for bearing with me through that. I know that this Greek stuff can be a little bit dry, but I think it's kind of a helpful foundation that as we kind of get to looking into more specifically and more of the meat about who these men are, what they're doing, I think it will be helpful to kind of have these terms defined and it's kind of a helpful setup. So thank you all. We'll dismiss for today.